I could not believe I was here. Of all the places and moments, it had to be this one. It was a warm Friday night in late August, the kind of evening when the air is thick with anticipation and everything seems to hum with possibility. I had been invited to Emily's house party, well, more like dragged there by my buddy Jake. He said it was going to be the kind of night we'd never forget. As I stood there, looking around at the dimly lit room, packed with people, music pulsing through the walls, I had no idea how right he was. Emily was there, of course. She had always been that girl, confident, magnetic, with a smile that could stop anyone in their tracks. I had known her for years, but tonight, something was different. Maybe it was the way her dark hair fell over her shoulders, or the way her dress hugged her curves just right, but suddenly, I could not take my eyes off her. The air between us crackled with an unspoken energy, and every glance she threw my way sent shivers down my spine. We had not really talked much before that night. Sure, we ran in the same circles, but I always assumed she was out of my league. Yet, here we were, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her skin when she brushed past me on the way to grab another drink. "Are you having fun, John?" she asked, her voice playful, almost teasing. She was standing way too close for casual conversation, and my heart raced. "Yeah," I muttered, trying to keep my cool, but the look in her eyes made it hard to focus. There was something electric about her tonight, something daring. Then, out of nowhere, she took my hand. Her fingers curled around mine with a surprising gentleness, but there was a heat in her touch that set off alarms in my head. This was not just a casual gesture. My mind flashed to Jake's warning from earlier, "Dude, don't get too close. She's bad news." But as she pulled me towards the back of the house, leading me through the crowd, I could not bring myself to care. I followed her down the narrow hallway, my pulse quickening with every step. The noise of the party faded behind us, and we found ourselves in a small, dimly lit room. The air felt thick and heavy, like something was about to happen. And it was. She closed the door behind us, the click of the lock louder than the music from the party. Suddenly, it was just us. Alone. The tension between us was suffocating, in the best way possible. Emily's lips curled into a smile, but there was something different about it now. Something darker, more dangerous. "I've seen the way you look at me, John," she said, her voice low and sultry, sending a shiver down my spine. "I know you want this." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. This was not the same girl I thought I knew. She was wild, unpredictable, and I was in way over my head. But I did not care. Before I could respond, she stepped closer, her body inches from mine, her breath warm against my neck. My heart pounded in my chest as her hand moved to the back of my head, pulling me closer. I could feel her lips ghosting over my skin, teasing, but never quite touching. "I shouldn't be doing this," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "but I can't help it." And then, before I could say anything, her lips were on mine, soft but urgent, like she had been waiting for this moment just as long as I had. The kiss was everything. Sweet, dangerous, and laced with the kind of passion that had been building up between us for months. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer, feeling the heat of her body against mine. For a split second, the world disappeared. It was just us, lost in the moment. Her scent filled my senses, intoxicating, as her lips parted slightly, letting me taste her. I could feel her fingers tangled in my hair, and the way her body pressed into mine sent a surge of desire through me like nothing I had ever felt before. But then, reality crashed back in. This was Emily, the girl who had a boyfriend, the girl who was supposed to be off limits. But here we were, breaking every rule, every line we had sworn not to cross. I pulled away, breathless, my mind spinning. "Emily, we can't do this," I whispered, even though every fiber of my being was screaming to keep going. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, vulnerable, but there was a fire in them that told me she was not about to stop. "I know," she whispered back, her voice shaky but determined, "but I don't care." She kissed me again, harder this time, and I knew I was in trouble. There was no going back now. Every kiss, every touch, it was like we were falling deeper into something we could not control. Her hands slid down my chest, tracing every muscle as she pressed herself closer. My body responded instantly, heat flooding through me as I pulled her against me, my hands roaming over the curves I had only dared to imagine before. We tumbled onto the bed, our bodies tangled in a mess of limbs and clothes, lost in the heat of the moment. Her skin was soft and warm under my hands, and the way she moved against me made it impossible to think straight. Everything about her was intoxicating, and I was powerless to resist. But as things escalated, a small voice in the back of my head reminded me of the one undeniable truth. This was wrong. This was forbidden. Yet, the more wrong it felt, the more right it seemed. The room was spinning, and so was my head. As our bodies moved together, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, I was lost in her, completely, utterly consumed by the need to be with her. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this could not last. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down around us. Everything about that moment was electric, every touch and whisper sparking something dangerous and exhilarating between us. Emily's breath was ragged against my neck, her body pressed so tightly to mine that it felt like we were two halves of a whole. As we lay there on the bed, her fingers traced lines down my chest, making me shudder with anticipation. My mind was racing, conflicted between what I knew was wrong and the undeniable pull toward her. I should have stopped right there. I should have gotten up, walked away, and pretended none of this had ever happened. But I didn't. I couldn't. Her lips were on my skin again, trailing from my neck to my collarbone, and each kiss was like a jolt of electricity straight to my core. There was no turning back now. "John," she whispered, her voice full of need, her lips hovering just inches from mine again. "I've wanted this for so long." Her words hit me hard. I wasn't the only one feeling this. She had wanted me too, just as much as I had wanted her, and now, finally, we were here. But there was something about the way she said it, almost like she was confessing a secret she had kept locked away for too long. It made my heart race even faster, knowing that this wasn't just some spur-of-the-moment fling. This was real, and that terrified me. Before I could say anything, her lips found mine again, more urgent this time, more desperate. I kissed her back with the same intensity, my hands roaming over her body, feeling every curve, every inch of her that I had only dreamed about. The tension between us was unbearable, like we were both on the edge of something huge, something we couldn't stop if we wanted to. As my hand slid beneath her dress, my fingers grazing her thigh, she let out a soft moan, her body arching against mine. The sound sent a rush of heat through me, and I couldn't help but push further, wanting more of her, needing to feel all of her. Her skin was soft, her body warm, and the way she responded to my touch was driving me insane. But then, just as things were about to reach the point of no return, she froze. Her body tensed, and her hands stilled against my chest. For a second, I thought I had done something wrong, but then I saw the look in her eyes, fear. "Wait," she whispered, her voice shaky, her eyes darting toward the door. "We can't. We shouldn't." I followed her gaze, my heart pounding in my chest. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about us. This was about the consequences. If anyone found out, if her boyfriend found out, it would be a disaster. The thought of what could happen if we got caught was enough to bring me back to reality, even if just for a moment. I pulled back, breathing heavily, my mind racing. "Emily, we don't have to do this," I said, even though every part of me was screaming to keep going. "We can stop right now." But the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She didn't want to stop. She wanted this as much as I did, maybe even more. Her fingers gripped my shirt, pulling me back toward her. "No," she whispered, her voice filled with determination. "I don't care anymore. I want you, John. I need you." Her words were like gasoline on a fire. Every ounce of doubt, every bit of hesitation, it all vanished in an instant. All that mattered was her, here and now. I kissed her again, harder this time, my hands sliding up her thighs as I pulled her closer. The tension between us snapped, and suddenly we were both lost in each other. In the heat of the moment, clothes were discarded, thrown haphazardly onto the floor as we gave in to the desire that had been simmering between us for far too long. Her skin was hot under my touch, her breath coming in soft gasps as I kissed her neck, her chest, every inch of her that I could reach. The sound of her voice, breathless and needy, sent waves of heat through me, and I could feel the same fire burning inside her. But even as we got caught up in the moment, that small voice in the back of my mind kept whispering that this was wrong, that we were playing with fire. And the more I tried to ignore it, the louder it got. "Emily," I whispered against her skin, my voice shaky. "What about him?" Her body tensed under me, and for a second, I thought she was going to stop everything. But then, she shook her head, her fingers tightening their grip on my shoulders. "He doesn't matter," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Not right now. Not tonight." Her words sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. She was right. Tonight, it was just us. Nothing else mattered. Not the consequences, not the fallout. Just this moment, the two of us together. I pushed everything else out of my mind as I kissed her again, harder this time, my hands exploring every inch of her body. The heat between us was almost unbearable, and I could feel her heart racing against mine as our bodies moved together. Every touch, every kiss, it was like we were feeding off each other's energy, pushing each other further and further. As our bodies finally came together, it was like everything else disappeared. The only thing that existed in that moment was the two of us, lost in each other, every movement, every breath in sync. It was raw, intense, like nothing I had ever experienced before. And I knew, even in the middle of it, that I was in way over my head. But I didn't care. As we lay there afterward, tangled in the sheets, the reality of what had just happened started to sink in. Emily was quiet beside me, her fingers lightly tracing patterns on my chest as we both stared at the ceiling, lost in our own thoughts. For a long time, neither of us said anything. The silence was heavy, filled with the weight of everything that had just happened, and everything that would come next. My mind was spinning, replaying every moment, every touch, every kiss. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized just how much trouble we were in. I turned to look at her, my heart pounding in my chest. "Emily, what are we going to do?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she sighed, turning to face me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I really don't know." And just like that, the weight of reality came crashing down around us. The weight of what we had done hit me hard as we lay there in the stillness. The silence felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls of the room were closing in on us. Emily had her back to me now, her body curled up on the edge of the bed, her breathing steady but quiet. I could feel the tension between us, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a storm about to break. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence. But what could I say? We had crossed a line, one we could never uncross. And no matter how good it had felt in the moment, I knew the fallout was going to be brutal. For both of us. My mind was racing, running through every possible scenario of what might happen if someone found out. If he found out. Emily's boyfriend, Chris, was no small obstacle. The guy had a temper, and if he ever got wind of what had happened between us, it wouldn't just be messy. It could get dangerous. My pulse quickened at the thought of it, my chest tightening with anxiety. "I should go," I said quietly, my voice barely louder than a whisper, not wanting to disturb the uneasy peace between us. But as soon as the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Emily tensed, and for a moment, I thought she was going to ask me to stay. Part of me wished she would. Despite the whirlwind of guilt and fear spinning in my chest, the thought of leaving her now, after what we had shared, felt wrong. But another part of me knew staying would only make things worse. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft and laced with uncertainty. "Maybe you're right," she whispered. "Maybe it's better if you go." Her words cut deep, sharper than I expected. I sat up, the cool air hitting my skin as I reached for my clothes, scattered haphazardly across the floor. Each movement felt slow, deliberate, like I was delaying the inevitable. I couldn't shake the feeling that once I walked out that door, things would never be the same between us again. I had barely pulled my shirt over my head when she spoke again, her voice softer, almost vulnerable. John. I froze, turning to look at her. She had shifted in bed, now sitting up, the sheets wrapped around her body. The dim light from the hallway cast a soft glow over her face, and I could see the conflict in her eyes, the same uncertainty I was feeling. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice wavering. I didn't have an answer. Hell, I didn't even know what was going to happen in the next 5 minutes, let alone tomorrow or the days after. All I knew was that things were about to get very, very complicated. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice heavy with the weight of the unknown. "But we can't keep doing this." She looked down, her fingers nervously playing with the edge of the sheet. "I don't regret it, you know," she said quietly, almost like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. "I meant what I said earlier. I've wanted this, wanted you for a long time." Her words sent a surge of conflicting emotions through me. I wanted to believe her, wanted to think that what we had just shared was more than a mistake. But there was no denying the truth. It was wrong. We had broken a rule, a promise, and no matter how we tried to justify it, we couldn't ignore that fact. "Emily," I started, but the words got caught in my throat. How could I tell her that I felt the same, that I had been thinking about her for months, fantasizing about moments like this, even though I knew better? The truth was, as much as I wanted her, I couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at me. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. She stood up from the bed, letting the sheet fall away, revealing her body in the soft light. My breath hitched as I took her in, but this time, the sight of her didn't bring the same rush of excitement it had earlier. Now, it just reminded me of the mess we were in. "I need to figure things out," she said softly, more to herself than to me. Her voice was calm, but I could see the turmoil in her eyes, the conflict she was wrestling with. "Chris, I need to tell him." The mention of her boyfriend's name hit me like a punch to the gut, and suddenly the full weight of the situation came crashing down on me. This wasn't just about Emily and me. There were other people involved, other lives we were about to upend with this secret. "Emily, are you sure that's a good idea?" I asked, my voice laced with concern. The last thing I wanted was for her to get hurt, and I knew Chris. He wasn't the kind of guy who took betrayal lightly. She looked up at me, her expression conflicted. "I don't know what else to do," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I can't keep lying to him. It's not fair." I took a step toward her, reaching out to take her hand. Her skin was soft, warm, and I could feel the slight tremble in her fingers as I held her. "Emily, maybe we just take some time," I suggested, my voice gentle. "Think things through before making any decisions. You don't have to do this right now." She met my gaze, and for a moment, I thought she was going to agree. But then she pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to shield herself from the weight of everything that was happening. "I can't live like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not." I wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that we could figure this out together, that we didn't have to rush into anything. But deep down, I knew she was right. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. The only way forward was to face the consequences, no matter how painful they might be. "I'll talk to him," she said finally, her voice resolute. "I'll tell him the truth." My stomach churned at the thought of what that conversation would look like. Chris wasn't the kind of guy who handled bad news well, especially not this kind. I didn't want Emily to get hurt, didn't want things to spiral out of control. But there was nothing I could do to stop it now. She looked at me one last time, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and something else I couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry, John," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never meant for this to happen." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to fix any of this. All I knew was that I was about to walk out of this room, and nothing would ever be the same again. Without another word, I grabbed my jacket from the chair and made my way to the door. As I reached for the handle, I hesitated, turning back to look at her one last time. Emily stood there, wrapped in the sheet, looking as lost and uncertain as I felt. And then, before I could change my mind, I walked out. The night air hit me like a slap in the face, cold and biting, as I stepped outside. The party was still raging on in the background, the music and laughter a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in my mind. I shoved my hands in my pockets and started walking, my thoughts a jumbled mess of guilt, fear, and regret. I had no idea what would happen next. All I knew was that I had just crossed a line I could never uncross. And now, there was no turning back.